I'm going to take a few minutes just as we settle in to remind people that today is actually 14 years since the 2008 apology to residential school survivors. And, you know, I think one of the things that was really interesting that came out of that apology is, I guess, two things. I remember being there and listening to Phil Fontaine make the grand statement that this was the end of white supremacy in Canada. And as we all sat there and listened in the audience, like at the time in 2008, we were like, wow, did he just really say that? Because it was one of those things that you didn't feel like you had permission to say. You didn't feel like you had permission to have those kind of conversations. And I remember Stephen Harper saying there's no room in Canada today for the types of attitudes and thoughts that led to that system. And yet we can still talk about an education system where our children have to travel very far away to get basic education. We have seen the coverage, I think, really good coverage coming out of APTN about the child welfare system and through advocates like Cindy Blackstock that show that those systems and those attitudes are still in there today. There was, interestingly, I had worked at CBC last year. I was the managing editor of their investigative unit. And while we were there, there was this discussion happening about a documentary that they put up, and I think it was from either 1952 or 1962. It was black and white. It was called Through the Eyes of the Children. And it was a documentary about Kamloops. And it was just kind of up on the site as this historic document. They've pulled it down, they've since put it back up and talked about the context around it. Because when the discovery of the graves came at Kamloops, everybody went back and looked at that documentary that was really reinforcing that system, showing kids going into the school, showing kids praying, sitting there and saying, wow, the school's doing a great job. It's really teaching these kids to, you know, control themselves and be obedient and do all these things. And you look back and you say, God damn it, where were the journalists? Where were the journalists back then? Where were the people probing into the system and asking questions about whether or not it was okay, even if you didn't know the abuse was going on? Asking, is it okay to take children away from their parents against their will? Very basic human rights question. So we're at a point post-2015 where we're still having a lot of discussions about truth and reconciliation. And we had a pre-meeting about this, what we were going to do at the panel today. And we want to challenge you to think outside your comfort zone today. And we're going to break this into two sessions. The first part, we're going to talk a little bit about the stories and why the stories that need to make it out, why we think they're not making it out. And then we're going to talk about what it's like to be us inside these newsrooms trying to pound out these stories or get somebody to listen, the stories that we think are important and get them covered, why that's not happening, and why you're seeing so many young Indigenous people fleeing newsrooms and going to do something else. So I want to introduce my panelists. We're going to start with Nicole McCormick, who's here on the far end. Nicole McCormick is a proud now I'm going to mess up. Ganyegahaga, thank you. I had it beforehand. Mohawk woman, whose family is from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. She's a senior manager newsgathering at CityNews Toronto, Rogers Sports and Media. Nicole has worked as a journalist behind the camera for 20 years and has worked in both Canadian and American news markets. Outside her role in the newsroom, Nicole is the founding member and chair of the Rogers Indigenous Peoples Network. Riley Yesno, who's right here beside me, is a queer Anishinaabe writer, researcher, and public speaker, Abatang First Nation. Riley grew up primarily in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and currently calls Toronto, Ontario home. She's a freelance writer motivated by stories in the service and liberation, and a PhD student at the University of Toronto, where she is a Vanier Scholar. She's also in the process of writing her first book. And Kelly Boutsalis, sorry. I always do this. I know the pronunciations. I get up here and I get nervous and I'm reading and it just all goes out the window. This is why nobody ever put me as an anchor on TV. She's a writer and journalist based in Toronto, previously from the 6 Nations Reserve. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Refinery 29, Elle Canada, The Walrus, The Narwhal, Chatelaine, and the Toronto Star. She led the CBC Six Nations pop-up bureau earlier this year and is now freelance writing and associate programmer for Canadian film at TIFF. So there we go. The first thing that I want to ask is, what are newsrooms still getting wrong when they cover Indigenous stories? And who wants to go first? Maybe we can start. You want to start beside me? Okay. Riley? Go for it, Riley.
Oh, it's already on. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm not used to in-person conferences anymore. It's so weird. Hello. Yeah, so when we were prepping for this, I think in relevance to this question, I said, like, I've got to feel like a weird relationship with journalism. I say journalism and we're in an open relationship. You know, I come and go as I please. I take what I want and not. And so I see from that, like, two answers from two different perspectives. One is like what stories I will take because I want to take them and can be in a relationship with journalism that way. But more often I find like I'm the person that like the editors and the journalists reach out to for a story or for a comment or for, you know, something like that. And so there's, I think, also knowledge to be gained to that question there. So the first one is that I tend to only take stories that, and they're rare, I'll say, that are in service of, as my bio says, liberation. I think in journalism, like in maybe more like progressive journalism circles, we think like the extent we get to is like we talk about solutions journalism a lot, right? But I think that that's maybe a little bit abstract and doesn't really get to the point. And the point for me is that if my writing isn't doing something to serve Indigenous people, liberating them from oppressive structures of colonialism, trying to rewrite the legacy that the institution of media of harm that has been posed on them, then it's something I'm not really willing to work at. And I think that when we're in an industry that prizes objectivity and coming in and telling all truths and these whole things, this very clear wearing it on your sleeve, like, no, I'm here in service of Indigenous people, full stop, sometimes can get a little bit tangly and hairy. And there are little pockets where this, I think, is like becoming more prevalent and more accepted, but it's, I would say, certainly not mainstream. And then on the other flip side of things, when somebody reaches out to me, I have a handful of like editors and producers who, you know, if they call me up, I'll always make time to give them an interview. I'll always make time to do something like that. And the reason why, though, is because they have invested substantial time and resources into creating relationships with me outside of, you know, them taking my stories and my quotes. And so we sometimes talk about how journalism has to become less extractive, which is, I guess, what this is getting at, right? Instead of like hastily calling me up at 6 a.m. and being like, I need to get a story out now, please give me all your words. These are people who like actually forged relationships, who went out with and met up with me without their recorder on their hip, and, you know, who wrote sometimes letters of recommendation for me, and who made efforts to make connections with not only me, but with my community. And I trust that if I'm giving them a name of somebody else who's going to give it to them, I know that they're in good hands. And so that's something that takes, you know, more time and more investment than I think we're typically used to getting. We very much feel like cogs in a machine, I think, a lot of the time. And so, yeah, I would say those are maybe two things. Journalism in service of not just solutions, but liberation, and journalism that is more reciprocal than extractive.
And Kelly, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. I was leading the CBC Six Nations pop-up bureau for, I think it was about 6 months or so. And I found that in the micro level, there was a lot of what Riley was describing, the journalism where it wasn't extractive, it was reciprocal. We wanted to build a community, we needed to build trust in that community, especially coming from the CBC into a community that had long been mistrustful and been misrepresented. So we worked hard on that, and our output wasn't particularly, like we weren't churning out these stories, let's say. We had several stories, I was really pleased that we worked on op-eds, and it felt to me a little bit like narrative sovereignty, that I was coming to someone and saying, we will pay you for your words. I really wanted to get a residential school survivor to talk to us in their own words, because I felt like we had just been coming in, extracting a quote or two, even though they've been pouring out their hearts and their stories to us, and give them the entire space. And I got to do that, and that made me really happy. And at the same time, though, there were issues because we were a small, very small team within the CBC, working with CBC Hamilton, that we would do a story and it would be really great and thoughtful, and the editor I was working with, the producer I was working with, thought about, how we're saying things. She nixed a headline that said Canada's Indigenous people, and she caught it first and she showed it to me, and I was like, you're right, get rid of it. But it was because...
Sorry, Kelly, can you just explain what's wrong with that in case people don't?
Oh, because we do not belong to Canada. We do not belong to Canada. We do not belong to the United States. And so she was really great, but she was only one person. And so once we would have our NAT edits, things would just get removed from that, very careful and thoughtful relationship approach. And so I found that it was a really good experiment that I hope that they are continuing, but it had good intentions, and again, was only on the micro level. It wasn't across the board by any means, and even while I was there were headlines that came out that were from other units that just were very disrespectful to the communities that they were reporting on.
So I'm going to go to Nicole, but I want people to just pick up on something Kelly said, and I think, like in university these days, we're using the term implicit bias. It's a bias that exists in newsrooms when you're thinking about a story and you're thinking about your audience and you're thinking about them. Why do they care about the story, or how do I speak to them? But you're thinking of that audience being like yourself. And maybe yourself is not actually the audience that you're serving, or they're not the people in the story who you've talked to. And I think that's how mistakes like Canada's Indigenous people happen. Or, back in the days, the bad old days of missing murdered Indigenous women coverage, you could picture this kind of white boomer male, and there's nothing wrong with being a white boomer male, but saying, why do we care about that woman who was murdered, that Indigenous woman who may have been a sex trade worker that was down by the river? And you think, well, as a white boomer male, I don't want my kids playing down there. That's dangerous. And so you write, Native sex trade worker killed by river is the headline that you get, because you're warning people, let's keep our kids away from there. Like, our community needs to be away from that area because it's dangerous for our kids. Instead of the kind of headline that a non-Native woman would get, which might be, Marcy, we miss you. Family mourns their mother, right? And there's been a lot of writing about that. So extraction and implicit bias. Nicole?
Well, I think for me, it's a few things. I still think, with mainstream media, the whole story is not being told, because we still only tend to focus on residential schools or, something that makes national headlines. And as we all know, there was time before residential schools and there was time after residential schools. And those stories are not being told because oftentimes the pressure is completely on the one Indigenous journalist working in a newsroom, which is often the case. And that's been my case for 20 years. I've often been the only Indigenous journalist working in a newsroom. So there's oftentimes an external pressure, but more of an internal pressure to make sure that my newsroom in particular gets it right. But we're only getting it right a lot of the time when my eyes are on it, or if I'm the one pitching the story. Some of my reporters have no problems taking on the fun stories, about Indigenous Fashion Week and really highlighting the great work of a lot of Indigenous people. And those stories deserve to be told. But if you talk to any Indigenous artist or, any Indigenous person, there's a story behind the art, right? There's so much more depth to that. And oftentimes it doesn't get told. And when you pitch a news story, like women dying in Winnipeg, 3 Indigenous women dying in Winnipeg in less than a month, or, the bigger situation with land back, up in the Caledonia area. The stories can go on and on. Oftentimes those stories don't get told because then you have to explain why people should care, or why a Toronto audience would care about what's happening in Caledonia. And I understand we're a local station, but if you ask any one of us, these are human rights stories. They are not necessarily need to be made local, because if you have a mother, a daughter, a brother, whomever, a family member, all you need to do is put yourself in our positions and think for a second, would you ever want the atrocities that we faced, or the women's stories not getting told, or whatever it might be? You would never want that for your family member. And when you think about the fact that we're all human, you got to take it away for a second and think about, you wouldn't want that happening to anybody any of your family members, so maybe you should actually care about your fellow human beings and figure out a way to make it mainstream and palatable.
And I think that's so important, the story selection. And it's so rare still that we see Indigenous stories making it to the top news story. And it's frustrating because we sometimes hear these things like, well, if Indigenous people are 4% of the population, maybe they should get 4% of the stories, which I guess is a really mathematical and clinical way to look at it. But if you sit there and say 50% of the human rights abuses happening in Canada are happening to Indigenous people, if you sit there and you look at the systems that are hurting children in the country and who's being the most hurt, who's the most poor, why, and you start asking the question, who's mostly in the prison? Why is that disproportionate? You'd think that a lot more attention would be paid to it if our job is to shine light in dark places, if our job is to expose systems that, aren't working as advertised. That is what drives a lot of people to get into journalism. And so I think the story selection is really important. And there's 2 things that are in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I think are really relevant, because everybody kind of looked at the calls to action at the bottom, but they did say media has to engage in its own acts of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And I would encourage anybody, and I'm going to mention a book in a minute, but to go and take a look and engage with some of what's being written about news and how Indigenous people are covered and how some of the stereotypes are still in there, and really try to work your mind around it and work your way out of it. That's an act of reconciliation. To sit there and take a look at your own organization, not just the government organization, but your own, and say, where historically have we gotten it wrong, and have we figured it out yet? And I think the other thing that's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, it says, to Nicole's point, we've got to move off the stories. It's not just about residential schools, right? It talks about, and I go back to what Phil Fontaine said and what Prime Minister Harper said 14 years ago on the day of the apology. It's about ending the notions of white supremacy and the thoughts that led to that system and kept that system still existing, or keeps the systemic racism still ongoing in the systems that we deal with from day to day. And so those are the kind of stories beyond residential schools that we can be looking for, that serve Indigenous people and aren't just extractive. So the book that I wanted to mention, it's Indigenous People in Canada's Television News. And it's by Angela Mongebello. Now, she's not Canadian, and she's an English professor. But one of the things that she did that was super interesting is she took a look at APTN, CTV, and CBC's coverage of Idle No More. And she looked at 4 months of it. And it was very interesting that CTV focused, remember this was happening around Christmas? CTV very much focused on conflict and the fact that there was traffic being blocked, because a lot of the stories were about people couldn't get out to go Christmas shopping. APTN, and full disclosure, I worked at APTN at the time, so yeah. But it's just the implicit bias of APTN, I guess, looked at this and we said, this is about water, right? Because everybody was out there blocking roads and demonstrating and protesting because of the omnibus bill that was going through about water. And then CBC said Indigenous rights and was a little vaguer. So you had the same story, you had several people covering it, and you had these different lenses. Canadians, depending who they watch, were getting very different stories of what this was about. So those are the kind of things that I think we need to engage with. And so I want to ask each of you, who's getting it right? Who's doing it well right now?
I guess I'm going to keep the same order.
Yeah.
I decided.
I'm looking at you. And you can say a reporter or a piece that you've seen or a newsroom that you like to engage with.
Yeah. Well, this is definitely bias on my part, just because she's a bit of a mentor to me. But I started writing with Tanya Talaga when I was like only 16 years old. I sent her like a DM on Twitter, and I was like, "Hi, I love you so much. Thank you so much for writing about Thunder Bay." And she was like, "Do you want to get dinner?" And I was like, "Yes." So one of the things that I admire so much about Tanya, when you hear her talk about how she got started about writing specifically about Northern Ontario, right, is that she lives in Toronto and has for most of her life. But then when she decided and was called to write Seven Fallen Feathers, and now writes mostly about Northern Ontario and produces work about Northern Ontario, she invested. She invested her time, her resources, her money. Everybody in the community knows her. She goes, and I was her assistant for like a hot sec, and like the amount of unpaid labor that woman does for the community is mind-blowing. But it's because she knows that she has to make those sorts of services in return to the community that she writes about. Not only because that's like, it's not like just this trade exchange thing, but that's how she makes her relationships so meaningful that they're willing to share with her, so that she writes such excellent stories that she does. The other person I'm thinking about, I don't know if he would consider himself a journalist or not, but Jesse Wente is one of those people that, to me, like always has it like on his sleeve what he cares about. It's none of this like, well, other people might say this, but these people might say this. He's very much like, this is what I think, this is why it's important, and this is why I maintain that we talk about it this way. And I think that is like great, because it breaks away like this thing that I hate in journalism, when basically journalists act like either like scribes or note takers, and don't, instead of like investigating the ways that they maintain the power of the people that they claim to hold accountable. And that's something that I think he does really well. And yeah, there's a lot of Black media in the States especially too that I think about in this regard, but I'll leave it there.
Mine are podcasts. There's two really incredible podcasts out right now. Duncan McHugh is doing Cooper Island, and he has an all-Indigenous team working with him, just really actually just going and investing in a community and those residential school survivors and getting their voices out there in their own way. And Connie Walker's, all of her podcasts, I highly recommend. There's the brand new one. What's that one called again? Just now? Stolen, yes. Stolen is incredible, and she is doing trauma-informed research, and the most incredible interview, and I feel the same way. I DM her, and she writes back, and I'm like, ah! and she featured a residential school survivor who was so... what she did is she showed a variety of takes, because obviously all these people have had way different experiences and come at the storytelling that we're doing now in a vastly different manner, because they're all individuals. And this one specific interview she did where the residential school survivor basically said, like, Connie, don't do this. And it totally changed how she was approaching it and her story, and it made her wrestle with her journalism and what was her journalism doing. And she included that all. She put it all out there, and it was just incredible reporting from her.
I mean, Tanya Talaga goes without saying. I mean, for me, it was quickly when I was hosting a panel, actually, and same thing, I wrote her, told her I loved her. Will you come do my panel? She's like, sure, what time and when, right? Like, I just adore her. But, I mean, everybody you've mentioned, Duncan, Connie, Willow Fiddler, Tanya Talaga, all, huge role models and mentors for me. But what I want to actually acknowledge is the work of a non-Indigenous reporter. We did a story, Melanie Ng, and Giancarlo DeSantis, cameraman and a reporter with CityNews. Melanie hosts BT. And we were focusing last September 30th on residential schools. And I got Melanie to go to the Mohawk Institute, the former Mohawk Institute Residential School. And we went inside the school, and we did a tour of the school. And it was one of the first times since they started doing the construction of the school that media was allowed in. And what really impressed me with Melanie, I got us in. I made, those are all my contacts. Those are my family members. I got us into the school. But when we approached the school, I quickly taught Melanie the tobacco offering, which is the ultimate sign of respect in our culture. And just realizing as soon as Melanie saw the school and just the tears in her own eyes, right? She knew the importance of what that school had meant to our history. And same with Giancarlo. And Melanie had done her research. She was, she'd done her research. She was her approach was very trauma-informed. And so she met with residential school survivor Geronimo Henry that day. And Geronimo is one of my favorite human beings on this planet. And so I was very, like many of us, we get very nervous and very cautious when you're introducing someone to so important in your life. But she did the tobacco offering, which was beautifully done. And so when she was going to lay the tobacco on Mother Earth, because it was during COVID, normally we would exchange it, Geronimo looks at me and is like, yo, is she Native? Like, he was so, caught off guard and so beautifully respected. Like, he started to tear up. He's like, he just didn't realize what was actually happening. And that really made me quite happy. And that moment set the tone for the entire interview. And Melanie was very respectful. Her questions were respectful. She gave Geronimo time when he needed it. She let him guide the interview. She let him guide him to particular areas of the school that he has emotional connections with. This was very much Melanie just being the conduit to Geronimo's story. And if you watched her story, Geronimo did all of the talking. And that's so important, is giving the Indigenous person the way to tell their own story. And that's, I think, just a real beautiful display of what non-Indigenous journalists should be doing when they approach our stories, is taking that time and understanding that this isn't your story to tell. It's theirs, and you want to get it right. And I will say that we did win an RTDNA award for that story, which is pretty awesome, right? But it was a non-Indigenous reporter doing that work in hand in hand with me. And that's the beauty of that, right? It was Melanie giving me full credit for, what I brought to the story in knowing that she was standing in the community because of me, but then watching the beauty of how Melanie approached that story. And Giancarlo's work visually approaching that story, and the editor, it was just truly a very beautiful display of teamwork. And that's how those stories should always look like, is wanting to let the person tell their story in the best way possible, and you taking them with all the love and respect that you have for that person in that story.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually bounce off that idea of non-Indigenous reporters to maybe segue into what it's like to be us in newsrooms. I'm going to do it in this way. That non-Indigenous people can do a great job. We always get asked this, do I have permission? Can I do these stories? It's of course. It's the way that you do them. But of course you can. And when I was at APTN, 25% of that newsroom is non-Indigenous reporters. And they learn how to, it's kind of like a reverse assimilation process. They learn how to adapt to that culture and go in. But they're so valuable, because I'm going to give a shout out to Kathleen Martins, who got a Press Freedom honor earlier this year. And she did a lot of work on Me Too. She is non-Indigenous, and one of the things that she really brought into the newsroom was an outside perspective on violence against Indigenous women, because as Indigenous women, we often normalize a lot of the violence that we're growing up with. And it was really valuable to me when some of my reporters, I was sending them out into the field, and now I'm going to confess to you why I was a shitty boss sometimes. I just expected them to take it. I mean, I remember being at a press conference when Stephen Harper was still in opposition, and my boss had sent me out to ask him about treaty rights. And when I shouted out the question, if you remember in those early days of Harper, he kind of had like a little problem with his security and with some of the people who were showing up at his rallies. And so I said, Mr. Harper, do you believe in treaty rights? And somebody just came up and karate chopped me in the back of the neck and said, shut up, you liberal mouthpiece. And I didn't even think about anything. I just, like, did we get the shot? You know, and so when I was sending my reporters out, you know, I always thought like I was woke because we had these programs and we asked them how we were doing, but I couldn't kind of see always what was happening to them. I should have known better, right? I should have known, like when I was falling apart, covering these stories of residential school survivors, and then I was like making everything kind of fit to print. And I was watching the tape, and I was watching somebody talk about something very traumatic and rewinding and replaying and rewinding and replaying and looking for the clip. I was absorbing a lot of that, and I just thought I should handle it, and I just expected that my reporters were doing fine. Until the UN asked me, United Nations, UNESCO asked me to do a report on what it's like to be an Indigenous female journalist in Canada today, and nobody had ever asked before. I started interviewing, you know, people in the industry and some of my own staff, and they told me how I had failed them. And I want to say, yeah, but we have programs for this. Yeah, but you didn't reach out. Yeah, but you didn't tell me. But, you know, you can't yeah, but somebody when they're telling you that you failed them, and I learned that I have to actively check in. So it's one of the lessons that I took in, and I learned to be a better boss. So I'm going to ask to do a round of why we're fleeing this industry, what is hard to take, and I'm going to ask everybody to try to listen with open ears and not yeah, but.
I mean, I feel like there's probably a lot of reasons. Unfortunately, remember, I keep thinking about like these couple of interviews I had done for like small stints in newsrooms. And, you know, at the end of the interview when they're like, okay, do you have any questions for us? And my question always would be, you know, I've been in workplaces before where and sometimes like nobody's like trying to be malicious or anything like that, but like it's a harmful environment to be an Indigenous person in. What sort of accountability mechanisms do you have in place for something when something like this happens? Like what procedures, who could I go to? Is there something, whatever? And like the amount of times people would be like, oh, well, we've never had that happen. Or they'd be like, oh, well, there's like, that's, I think we talk about it like adults, was one thing I got one time. And I was just like, oh my God. And like, well, funnily enough, like that's not what all of the Indigenous staff that I talked to before I came into this interview told me, right, in my preparation. So there's like this huge disconnect and probably this like urge to yeah, but, or to minimize and to all of these things. And I don't think that, also, media realizes that like they are an institution going into communities and bringing in Indigenous journalists in the same way that like the police are, that child welfare is, that like all of these things, like I think journalists think like we are in service of truth and accountability and all of these things, so we're better. But I'm like, when you're on the other side of that, it's like, no, you're an institution just like all of them. And so you're asking Indigenous people also to come into that space and then go to their contacts and their communities now wearing that badge. And like what do you have in there to service them? Are these journalists also then scrounging for money or, you know, resources or fighting to get these stories told when they already have to now work for this credibility among their own people again because of how harmful this legacy has been? I just think that there's like a real exceptionalism that exists in the industry that makes it really, really hard to call in or call out in any sort of meaningful way that produces a change. So yeah, that's a big unlearning job.
Can I just, back to what Riley had said before about extraction. It's one of the things that happen. We get hired in and people are like, oh, you can get the connection, like they're not talking to us anymore. And they don't know why the community's not talking to us, but now we've got an Indigenous person, that Indigenous person is gonna go in. And you're just like, oh my God, what am I walking into? What did this newsroom do to these people? And then you're asked to do the same kind of extractive journalism. and trying to tell somebody that you don't want to do it a different way is very difficult. Kelly?
I feel like I have been mostly lucky, but also I think it's because I've had the choices. Like as a freelancer, minus the CBC Six Nations gig, I have been outside. I've come in, done the thing, and then not been part of the staff and had to deal with anything. One of the reasons that I was really happy that I had to weigh a lot of things with choosing to work with the CBC. It was, are they using my name? Are they using my status to force their way into the space that might not want us? And it weighs heavily. There are stories that our little team did where they would reach out to people and they would just say, no thanks. It's CBC, no thank you. And then so, that puts a lot on us. We're going to our own community and we're getting told no because we're in service of this big institution that has done them wrong time and time again. But I was glad that we had good initiatives. We did a workshop, and that was what I felt was probably the main reason that I said yes, because we went into the community and we opened it up to anyone, especially youth, and tried to show them, like, your voices are important. Maybe not for the CBC. That's what I was really thankful that the producers I worked with were like, yeah, this isn't going to be like a CBC training workshop. We want to get Indigenous people into journalism in any way possible. It does not need to be this way, but we want to kind of introduce you to the pathways you can take to make your own way in. So that was one of the reasons I said yes. But again, yeah, very hard to have all that weight, all the extra explanations, all the assumptions that we know certain people. I interviewed somebody who's on TV, and he's from Six Nations, and I thought we were just going to have like a nice little chat, and then instead he dumped all this like past relationships with the CBC on me, and I sat with it, and I came back to him, and I was like, listen, if you don't want to do the story and have your name attached to this, that's totally fine. We will work together again. And he was like, yes, that's what we'll do. And I went back to the bosses and said, we're not going to do this because of this reason. And they understood. But again, I feel like I have been lucky in a lot of instances because of good bosses, good intentions. So I am thankful for those good bosses with those good intentions.
I will say that having worked at the CBC, and there is like a group of Indigenous people in there that are really well listened to. And so like we're seeing that change in the broadcaster. And I think it has to do a bit with numbers and volume and being able to move something in that big machine because there's enough people. It's reaching like a critical mass. Yes.
But again, the good boss I had was not Indigenous.
Oh, there you go.
That was excellent. But again, with CBC, they have a group of Indigenous journalists which meet every month on Zoom just for the support, just to talk and connect across Canada. So that was also, I really appreciated that.
Yeah, Nicole?
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this question because it's a tough one for me, again, being the only Indigenous journalist working in the newsroom. And I think we're leaving because we're tired and we're exhausted and we're scared in some instances and we're lonely, right? Like, looking around my newsroom, because there's no other Indigenous presence, oftentimes I don't have anybody to back me up with particular stories that I want to tell. And, to everyone's point, that constant state of explanation as to why people should care about the story. It comes to a point where I'm at where I don't pitch the stories anymore. I stay silent, which doesn't help anyone. But at the same time, because I'm already exhausted with all of the other things that we're doing, that we're helping non-Indigenous reporters tell the stories, or we're finding great stories to tell that I know our reporters will take on, like those funner type of stories, right? I tend not to pitch the more serious stories that I believe, that my people deserve to hear from their own voice, but, Canadians deserve to hear. I don't pitch them because it's just too damn exhausting for me to do every single day of my life. And the one thing for me is that, you know, I worry that if I didn't have an Indigenous presence in the CityNews newsroom, I wonder if our stories will continue to be told. And I know that might be hard for some people sitting in the room right now who are from my newsroom. You know, I'm not confident that that would happen. And it's just because there's no other Indigenous voices in the newsroom. And I stay in journalism, you know, I've reflected on that a lot this week since we talked. I stay in journalism because of those exact reasons, which may sound weird, but I stay at CityNews and I stay in journalism because I do have to continue that fight. No matter how exhausting it might be, no matter how many times I cry in the bathroom because, you know, a story that I really want told won't get told. If it wasn't for us and everybody we've mentioned, those stories wouldn't get told the way they should be. So we fight. You know, we find the strength every day. We find the strength in each other. I knew I'd cry. They knew I would cry. Everybody who knows me knew I would cry. We find the strength in each other to keep going, right? You know, Karyn and I, you know, we talk all the time. You know, if I'm struggling, if she wants to vent, we talk all the time. We go to a cottage together and we just enjoy that time together. And we vent and we get it all out. You know, I've been following Riley and Kelly forever and ever on social media, and today we finally got to meet. But it's these three women here and the rest of our Indigenous circle of journalists that keep us in this business, because we all know each other's fight. You know, I join all of the conversations that Duncan McHugh does and everything online, because every time I listen to us talk, every time I listen to others talk, it's like I feel a lot less lonely, right? Because sadly, we're all going through the same type of thing. But the common thing is that we all have the fight in us. We stay in our particular lane and whatever passion we love so that we can keep telling our story however it might look. But you all have to know this is extremely exhausting work. And if you are a leader in your newsroom, no matter what platform you are, you need to check in with us a little bit more often. Right? When, you know, residential school news breaks or on a particularly tough story in a podcast, whatever it might be, you need to ask if we're okay. And it might seem small to you, and it might be something that you might not necessarily come to you naturally, but you need to do that because maybe we're not, and maybe we are too strong or proud to come to you to say, we're not okay with this, or we need to do more, or whatever it might be. So leaders do need to take on a little bit more of that responsibility, because sometimes we could just be too exhausted to go to you. So I think that's something we just really need to make sure that people are checking on each other. And the last thing I'll say is that if an Indigenous journalist does come to you and say, this story is really, really important, and here's why, but it might not necessarily reflect your local news brand, or, you know, it might not gain a lot of viewership, or it might not get tons of clicks. Really think about and work with that journalist as to how it could get those tons of clicks, or how it could be made more local. Because even though you might not see why that story is so important, we, the Indigenous people, are telling you it's important. You've got to listen to that.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. And I just want to say, you know, she's not alone. We've all been in that position where we said, I'm done. I'm walking out of here because of the pressure. You know, especially when you're the only one in the newsroom, everything is on that one person's shoulder to make sure that newsroom doesn't embarrass itself, you know, and to make sure that they are where they need to be. And there's those days where you just don't have the energy for it. And you just say, okay, you know, I've had enough. And so I think that, you know, like when I was at APTN, a lot of people leave APTN, go into a bigger newsroom because they feel like I'm going to have this bigger audience, but they come back. And these are the reasons that they go back into Indigenous media or they're leaving the industry. And we actually do have outside secret support groups for each other, which is how Nicole and I met, was through one of the secret support groups. So I think this is a point where we open it up for questions.
I love those microphones.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate you being here. My name is Rosa Huang. I'm the executive producer of CTV National News. So since I was appointed executive producer, I've made one of my priorities to improve our coverage of Indigenous people, and I knew sort of from the beginning that would include that we needed Indigenous journalists. So I brought in 2 people on our team, Karyn and Donna Sound. I would love to have more. I want to know, what could I do to encourage young Indigenous journalists who are maybe thinking about a career in broadcasting or in a newsroom, but they're not sure, and they may be struggling with some of the things that you talked about. How can I, as a non-Indigenous person, non-Indigenous news leader, encourage those young journalists to give this a shot?
I think for me, they have to know they're coming into a good culture, right? I think that's one of the most important things for me. Like, earlier on it was mentioned I'm the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Network at Rogers. So I've really worked hard over the past 6 years to create, an inclusive culture, and that extends to the newsroom itself. They have to know that you're going to listen to them. And by the way, it's nice to meet you, Rosa. They have to know that you're going to listen to them. And that's going to start in the interview process. It's going to start in the interview process when you're going to seek them out. They are going to ask you questions. Will my stories get, everything we've talked about, will our stories get on the air? Are you willing to listen to stories that might not be necessarily, mainstream type of thing? And, their only interaction and sometimes introduction to that newsroom is going to be you, right? So you've really got to reinforce that, yes, we are here to listen to you. Yes, there is a mandate to get more Indigenous stories, on the air, that you are working, to have a supportive and inclusive environment, whether it's workshops, whether it's, people on staff who can, listen, like, what do you call those programs at work? Like, when work gives you programs where you can call if you're having trouble, right? Like those kind of, exactly, those support systems if they are, and that the leadership there as well is there to listen, that if there's something, that they see wrong, that it won't be pushed under a rug, that, those, any concerns that they have will be dealt with head on as well. But you are the key to that. And that's a lot of pressure, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of pressure to, speak all of that to an Indigenous journalist or Indigenous student coming into your space. But I think it's really important that if it's important to you and you explain that to them, they're going to truly believe in what you're trying to do, and then you have to follow through with that, when you bring them on board. But I think it all starts with you and how, the messaging that you have towards them and the environment that they'll be coming into.
I would also add outreach. When we were trying to get for our community thing, we reached out to high schools who had Indigenous groups, and we wanted to start with the youth who are just starting to figure out, where am I going to go? And the reaction we got across the board were, oh my gosh, you're thinking of me, which is something that they didn't get before. And so I really like going at them from the high school level. A lot of my community has, education organizations that you can reach out to. And that's what I wanted to do, because I feel like a lot of Indigenous youth or people looking into a new career just don't see themselves because there's not that many of us. So you have to go to them to tell them, your voice is necessary and we are going to try to support it. So in the best way that you can, I do think you need to do the work of going into a community, going to universities, asking to speak with their Indigenous student supports, and identifying who might be interested, just to get the ball rolling, because a lot of them don't even realize this can be a career for them.
Well, just to quickly add to that too, with high schools, get them before they're made the decision. Right? A lot of them don't even know what journalism is, to be honest with you, at that particular age. So get them early so that before they make their lifelong decisions, you've gotten them at that young age to explain what journalism is, to explain that storytelling is natural for us, and that it could be a natural career for them as well. And then not only that, but follow up with them. right? Don't just go into a high school one day and say, hey, and throw a whole bunch of information at them, but go back in 6 months saying, hey, we talked to you 6 months ago. What are you thinking now? Have you done a little bit more research? You know, is there something more I can do to help you? It's the one undone thing that really bothers me, right? They go in once to a community, they go in once to a school and say, here's a whole bunch of information, or they extract a story, and then we never come back, and they never see you again. That's a major problem, because trust won't be built with one visit or one conversation. Sorry, Riley.
No, it's okay. I was going to add, I love this question. I think I'm the resident youngin' right now. I'm only 22, and once again, I started when I was 16, which is really rare, I realized at the time, and I love talking about the way I did it, because I Googled news editors in Canada, and then found somebody's email, and I was like, hi, I really want to write. And I was really grateful that I A, was very relentless, and B, had these editors that were like, okay, we'll give this weird 16-year-old a chance to publish. But that's really rare for young people, actually, like, because there's so many stipulations in place that you have to be like a certain age to enter this newsroom, or have to go through this many year-long program before you can get into this like internship thing. Like, there's all of these barriers in the way, like actually policy-wise, for young people to enter these spaces, that they wouldn't be, that you know, if there weren't there, I think there'd be more of us. I have been begging somebody from like CBC for forever to make like a CBC youth branch. Not CBC Kids, which I know they have, but CBC Youth for people like 25 to 18 years old in there, right? And like, that's something that there's just like a huge absence of in, I think, the media. And so if there's a possibility to change these sorts of policies and protocols and take a look at what sort of institutional barriers are actually in place that like young people begging to already have their CV written and want to put it in, but can't, right? And so like, that's one thing. And the other thing was, I think that in a very anti-Indigenous way, there's a lot of hierarchy in newsrooms, right? Like, it's like you start at the bottom and then you got to work your way up, and then you can go and do these things. And that's super frustrating, especially as a young person. And again, not at all how an Indigenous worldview that I'm taught works. But like, I remember being a teenager and like pitching a story. I pitched it in 2016 to like 5 different outlets, and I was like, we need to take down statues and rename things. People are talking about this. We really have to do it. And I got shut down so hard, and they were like, when you spend more time, Riley, then like maybe we can consider talking about this as like a one-off thing. And like, now in 2022, when we're renaming Ryerson University and taking down these statues, I want to be like, I told you so bad, right? But this comes from a culture, I think, of thinking that young people, like, A, have to earn the right to tell stories, and B, that they don't actually have these really valuable stories that they do. Young people are on the cutting edge of it. Like, they are there. And so maybe you need to workshop it with them a little bit to get it ready for publication, but I promise you, like, if you take the stories from young people, you will have the most cutting edge stories coming out of your newsroom. You will have the pulse on the ground, and that's young people's skills and gifts to us, and we really do not capitalize on it enough.
We also have to remember, sorry, Karyn, that we are the fastest growing population in this country, which are predominantly youth. And the youth are smarter, they're more engaged, they want our voices told. So everything that Riley just said is factually correct, especially in our numbers that Karyn was referring to earlier.
Yeah, and I had one more number to throw out. I think on reserve, it's a 60% dropout rate compared to 8% in Canada. So go to that story, find out why, and get rid of that systemic barrier, and you're going to get more people into graduating high school and into universities and into journalism programs. So, I mean, part of it is also addressing these systems. I'd say also just what we were saying earlier, go into communities and find out the truth about your brand and your past relationship, and find out why people aren't picking to work for you. Because there might be a relationship, a historic problem there that still needs to be reconciled.
And oftentimes they don't think that mainstream wants their voices, right? Which goes back to the conversation, Rosa, about telling them that we do want your voices. We do want you in the newsroom. We do want to change those metrics of being the only one or people leaving mainstream and going freelance. We want to change all of that, and that conversation comes directly from you in that hiring process.
I think I'm getting a flashing light. I don't know, do we do one more question or do we wrap up? One more?
Do two?
Fight.
Should I go?
There's two hands. Fight.
I really like what you said about checking in with the reporters, and I'm sitting here listening to you in my head, thinking how I would go about doing that with the Indigenous reporters that I work with, and I feel kind of paternalistic. Are you okay? You know, like, can you suggest kind of a practical way? Because I want to do that when I go back to my newsroom. What can I say to this person that's not going to sound paternalistic? What advice would you give?
Oh, thank you. Kevin.
For me, that's very quick. Acknowledge the story that they did, right? Acknowledge the good work they did. Acknowledge what may have gone into that story. Say, hey, Nicole, you did this, really powerful story today. I watched it, and I understand that this might have been difficult for you. How are you feeling about the story approach? It doesn't even necessarily need to be, how are you, Nicole? But how do you feel about the story approach? How did you feel about the story? The people you work with, were they trying, did they help you? Did they feed in your energy, right? If they're non-Indigenous, right? But you can do it that way. Acknowledge the work, and then just say, hey, how do you feel about your story? And in naturally, whatever feelings I may have had, or if I'm tired or whatever that will naturally come out if you're really looking at the work, I think.
Oh, I was just going to add really quick. I think making it part of a deliberate part of the culture in the newsroom and an active practice is great, as opposed to a one-time thing. Because I know if my boss came up to me and was like, "I'd like to have a chat with you later about this," I'd be like, "Oh God," right? So if it's a little bit of a precedence that it's no, we make time for each other to sit down and check in, and it's just a conversation, and we can really do this as an active every time thing. It definitely takes, I think, that little bit of pressure and scariness out of it.
What Riley said, I do that. I'm managing non-Indigenous journalists now, but once a month, I sit down, I make time to sit down with each of them to have 15 minutes just to talk about whatever they want to talk about. And I don't ask them necessarily any personal stuff. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just to check in on stories, but they have that space where they can say anything they want to me. Even if I'm, hey boss, you're doing a crappy job, they can say that too. And we'll talk about it.
I would even say it's just, for me, it would be just as simple as, that's a really heavy story. How are you? And I would be happy that you've opened that conversation for me.
There's one more.
Hi. So, as a non-Indigenous journalist, how can I support my Indigenous colleagues in the newsroom so they feel like they have an ally in the newsroom? And then also, how can I cover Indigenous stories without making my Indigenous colleagues seem like the token Indigenous person if I have any questions? And I apologize, I'm not sure if that's the language I'm supposed to be using, but just so that they don't feel like I'm always going to them to ask questions that they've been asked over and over again.
Back us up. Whenever we pitch a story that might not, again, be quote-unquote mainstream, back us up. And even if you don't know in that moment why you're backing us up, back us up. Because we're telling you it's important. And then, quietly off the side, I will come to you and I will acknowledge, hey, colleague A, thanks for that. And then I will be happy to tell you a little bit about it if you don't know. I know that sounds, counterproductive what we're saying about the educational part, but if you had my back and you didn't really know why, you just knew it was important, I will take the time to explain my thought process on that particular story. When it comes to the second part, again, this is only from my perspective. I don't mind helping you the first time, right? If you're approaching a story and you really want to get it right, and this is your first time with doing this story on your own, I will be happy to put my eyeballs on it. If you need help, making a contact or two, I will help you with that, but I'll also educate you in the process of how to make those contacts. Take a half a day out of your time, ask for a work ahead day, and go make some of those contacts and take the time to call the communities and make efforts with them. It's the end of that is the most important. It's the repeated asks that tend to really bother me. It's like, hey, 3 stories ago I taught you that. Why are you still asking me that? Right? And then if you need an extra set of eyeballs at the end of it, then let's talk. But go through the process first before you engage repeatedly with wanting to extract contacts or whatever it might be from me in particular.
I was just going to say, like as a last thing, that if it's, to me, I look out for, and like I think that like your Indigenous colleagues always see the coverage, the type of coverage that you do on even not just Indigenous stories, right? Like, I think that's something else like weird about newsrooms is that they like are like, okay, but we have Indigenous people and they're doing great Indigenous stories, and all of this other stuff is really bad and bad. And I'm like, and like we see that, right? And so I think like it's bringing in this like, I have like this quasi-Indigenous ethics of journalism framework that I use when I'm not even writing about Indigenous people, and I think that that's something that non-Indigenous journalists should do to make me like trust that you're a safe person to hold these stories, right? And so like just one example of what that kind of looks like is I think we often ask the question would this make a good story, or can I make this a good story? And the first question I notice that Indigenous journalists usually ask themselves is like, how does this story affect community? How does it affect the people that I'm trying to write about? And those are two different ways from the very inception of even thinking about how you go about something. And that comes from this Indigenous ethics framework that you can't get taught in J school. And so I think the more that we can incorporate not just in our interactions with Indigenous colleagues, not just in Indigenous stories, but in a holistic, cross-sectoral sort of way, the sounder we will also be.
Just come to those stories that you want to cover with respect and the context. I mean, there's a lot that you can ask of your colleague, but there's also a lot of information available online. So yeah, understanding what your ask is of those Indigenous colleagues and understanding how much extra, that also goes a long way.
I just want to say I really appreciate everybody coming out. Being here today and listening to us is a total act of reconciliation. 1 year to the 15th anniversary of that apology. So if anything you heard today was like new or something you could take back into the newsroom building up to that day next year, and not just that day next year, but the space in between now and that day next year that you think maybe I could do something a bit differently, it would mean so much, I think, to all of us, because we're on these panels all the time and we always kind of wonder, did anything come out of it? Did anything good come out of it? Did we change anything? Are we just saying this over and over again? It's going out into like a big space. Like at least we've got people here. It's not just on a Zoom where it's like, we don't know where it's going.
And please remember that it is National Indigenous History Month, right? Mm-hmm. Everything around you right now is a learning experience. There's an art festival down at the Harborfront right now. Like, this is the month where it is literally in your face to learn about Indigenous people, but not only just learn, but celebrate us and learn something new about what makes us all very unique. This is the month, it's in your face. Learn.
Oh, can I quickly add that because it is Indigenous History Month, freelancers like me get swamped. We can do Indigenous stories all year round.